What happens when a hospital becomes a fortress guarding sacred travel routes? Meet the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John, born from care and faith. They began in Jerusalem in the 11th century as a hospital for sick pilgrims and orphans. Papal approval came in 1113, and Raymond Dupuy became the first formal Grand Master, guiding them into a martial order. When Jerusalem fell in 1187, the order endured and later built power on roads from 1310 to 1522. They moved to Malta in 1530, where they forged a naval empire and kept a famous Maltese cross as their symbol.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I have fair warning, the audio is a little rough today. You know, when I started this little adventure 8 years ago to share my work online, it was a good idea because I thought, well, realistically, I was already 65 when I picked the microphone for the first time. And I thought, well, how about this? Instead of going away and gathering up all this data about what psychopaths and their impact on society is, I'll just share it as I go along. And I'm glad that I did that because I'm way too sick now that I have the information to compile it into a book. So things worked out okay, right? Anyhow, so back then I had a producer and a proper setup, so I would warn you, the audio will change at times. So, I tried to make things professional back then, but I wasn't gasping into the microphone like I am now, so now it's just me, holed up here in Nebraska, trying to share what I know while I still can. That's really just the bottom line, right? Always look for the simple answer in life, right? Okay, so why is this file here? And I never imagined the government would set out to silence me. It really never, ever crossed my radar. I did have a friend years ago when I wrote my book, which was before I went online, prior to 2017. That was several years before. It took me a few years to write. Writing books is not like, oh yeah, I just got it done in a few months. So when I got the book done, I decided, because I had a couple offers on the book to turn it into a podcast, and I really had never been thinking about podcasts or anything, right? I wasn't even really on social media. I was like 65 right then, and so it was a good idea, and so I thought, well, that's a great idea, but I have a little bit of caution before signing myself up with corporations after my experience with Intel back in my old Silicon Valley days. So I thought signing up with one of these big companies to have them produce my podcast sounded like maybe down the road not a good idea, and I'm glad I made that decision also. So I made the decisions that got me here along the way, right? But it never occurred to me, and I had this friend when I first came out with my book, a very close friend, and she was very concerned because of the work I was doing with psychopaths, right? Trying to figure out psychopaths and stuff. And so when I finally got my book written, her one comment to me was, well, do you think it's safe to use your own name? And I said, well, yeah, of course it is. Because I thought it would set me up to sound kind of sketchy if I started, coming on and sharing my work with some sort of, not even my own name or something. And she was truly, truly concerned, but I never shared any of that concern, right? Well, anyways, that was just in hindsight, right? So you just don't think that's going to happen, but now things are changing. I mean, what they're doing to me in my home, and I won't keep going on this part because I've recorded everything I've run across. What they're doing to me in my home with all this dirty electricity, they're basically doing to everybody. But when the government doesn't like you, evidently the silent war we're in, they have ways to crank up the transformers to your smart meters, and the rest is history, right? But I recorded it all, so if you're even a little bit interested, you might want to take a check, because we're moving into winter, and using your heat is about the worst thing you can do. And hey, it'll help to save you some money too, but using your heat will in fact cripple you. But anyways, I need to keep moving. Anyway, so, I never figured this stuff out. But when I first figured out the part about what they were doing with the smart meters and the transformer they'd hooked up to my smart meter on my property, well, then I had to have some pretty serious thinking, right? And I did think long and hard about it. And because you don't just one day decide, yeah, tomorrow never going to leave my house again. I'm just going to stay holed up inside. So after giving it serious thought, I thought, well, I think my best position here is to stay inside of my house. And I was starting to get kind of sick, but I thought, well, maybe driving is just not such a good idea for me. And, so that was just the instincts I was taking. So what did I do then? Well, that's when I bought weapons and cameras that don't run on the internet. So I suggest everybody do the same. Maybe you might not agree about the weapons part, but a lot of these people they're sending around doing different things against the rest of us, most of them are afraid of being shot in the foot, okay? So anyhow, so cameras that don't run on the internet are absolutely critical. All those Ring cameras that everybody has, well, I have pretty good ideas that they're playing with them before they come to your house. So if they have any concerns about you, they are showing up at people's doors. This is not fabricated imagination. So, and I've seen firsthand reports of people who happen to figure that they thought, well, I'll record this after the thing, and they go to access their Ring camera, and well, the thing had been shut off during that time that those people were there. And I read enough about it to think that, yeah, because they're starting to make mistakes, that's why you shouldn't have your Wi-Fi router, the one that your neighborhood could see, in your name. Don't make it easier for them to find your Wi-Fi box, because cops are blundering around right now, and they have this little plan where they're cutting certain wires before they come and talk to you, so you don't have any record of it. Go old school. Disconnect from all this stuff. I'm begging you, do not have everything online. Big mistake. Like if they roll around and undo your power and then they burn your house or do something, you'll have no way of recording it. So like I said, think about going old school. So anyway, so so if you listen today, just remember, I'm doing my best. It's just a crazy situation, but luckily I believe in reincarnation. And when things get tough, I remind myself, well, this is the greatest battle between good and evil, right? And I believe we come from an advanced society. And none of us are here by accident. It is an event we all signed up for before coming here. And actually, it's my honor to be here in this place and time. I mean, what a time. The big battle between all these psychopaths and parasites against the rest of us, right? So it's just actually a privilege, if we look at it a certain way, to document this evil. So, I started this stuff about 30 years ago, and I will cling to this microphone until my last breath because I have a lot more to say. But I chose today's subject just because of the sheer evil in tax theft. And as a bonus, I pieced together just a phenomenal amount of other connections, from Malta to those Maltese to the hospitaliers. All that stuff comes to pieces. It comes to one piece. Anyway, so since today's show focuses on moving money, I'm going to be talking about moving money. And I need to kind of, what I'm going to try to do is modify my own behavior when I record podcasts. And I need to kind of stick to the flow. So that reminder is really just for me. So if you think that I'm just moving from subject to subject, yes, I am. Because if you listen to me for any amount of time, I have a tendency to wander around a bit. So, and I wander around a bit because I've been doing this work for so many years that when I have the opportunity to put together a podcast, a lot of things come to mind. So it's really an opportunity for me also. So here's something very interesting, because Trump and all of them are into crypto, and these crypto people and the private equity people, they're all involved in what I'll be talking about today, this moving money deal, okay? So Trump and his whole family have made a lot of money using crypto, right? So the Russians, some Russian dude said this: there was a Eastern Economic Forum in Russia on, I guess, last year, September 2024, and this guy, Anton Kovalevsky, a senior advisor to Vladimir Putin, claimed the U.S. is preparing to use crypto and stablecoins to devalue its $37 trillion national debt. Well, that makes a lot of sense because don't forget who we're dealing with here, right? They're always out to make a scam, right? And I'm just going to give you a brief thing. His argument was this: the U.S. will then push the world into a crypto cloud and then shift liabilities into digital assets like stablecoins, making the debt cheaper to pay back, effectively leaving the rest of the world holding devalued dollars. And they're saying that other countries are stockpiling gold instead of embracing U.S. issued digital dollars. Now, but don't fall into that trap, okay? Just like supplements are for people who think they're wise to doctors, right? But they're really all made from the big pharma people. They've been pitching this gold thing for quite a while. I personally think it is total BS, okay? Because here's what they're doing is they're saying, well, we don't want to invest in the crypto stuff, and that's why there are rumors all over the people on social media saying, oh, so and so's switching to gold and blah blah blah, and oh, by the way, you can buy it from my gold guy here. I mean, talk about a sketchy crowd of people. So so if anyone believes that they're really changing to gold, is really real, I would caution you, okay? And so what they do is they fear a repeat of 1971 when Nixon ended gold convertibility, and they thought it was rug pulling global trust. So even with audits or blockchain transparency, foreign governments suspect the U.S. could change the rules again. Well, I mean, let's just take a little walk down history. Ever since whoever these people are landed here in this country, they obviously were in some sort of massive rage, right? It was bloody from the very beginning. Why doesn't anybody talk to the Indians first before they get a full understanding of how the U.S. plays by the rules, right? I mean, I gotta hand it to them. They played some, fantastically evil, slippery tricks on the native Indians. I mean, everything from when they built those dams and, they wrote contracts so the Indians, the Indians never saw a day that the buffalo wouldn't roam. So what's the U.S. government do? Well, they go in, they write a contract. Okay, we're going to take this land. You can have it as long as the buffalo roam. I mean, it's so simple and evil, right? So then what did the U.S. government do? Well, it went in on all those buffalo raids you read about gloriously in school, Buffalo Cody and all that. Well, that was a way to then starve out the Indians, right, and kill off the buffalo. Then they lost their land because that was in the contract. As long as the buffalo roamed, right, you have this land. Well, the buffalo are gone now, right? Well, guess who lost their land? So yeah, there's always a million different kinds of little tricks, but if you ever take the time to look behind them, they're always actually quite simple. But anyway, so let me just tell you what Putin's advisor said. And supposedly, he hasn't invented something new. He's reframing what the U.S. already does with inflation, but in a digital wrapper. And the theory is this: stablecoins could globalize and distribute the cost of U.S. debt management, exporting inflation as a kind of shared tax. Yeah, this lines completely with something these people would do, right? It doesn't take like a wild manic imagination. So whether it happens exactly as described is debatable, but the mechanism, inflation, dollar dominance, and tech adoption are how this leads us, right? Because right now, we're turning everybody's 401k retirement accounts over to private equity. Now, they're not going to immediately grab your money next week, but private equity I'll be talking about today because they're part of this huge money movement thing, which this whole show is going to be about. So private equity is really in the thick of this thing, right? With all the porn and all the stuff that's being shady money, tax money that I'll be talking about today. So your 401k is going to be handed over to these people. So I don't know, but nobody in their right mind should be taking financial advice from me. But I would take a hit and grab my money before it disappears like magic. And private equity will make that happen. I mean, they are thrilled now to have tons of investments in porn, gambling, and lots of things. That's what private equity, and I'll get into that very deeply today, that's what private equity is funneling their money into, right? So do you really trust them to play fair with your retirement? I mean, that's my only question. That's my only question. So anyway, today's episode starts with a grim reminder of how extremist propaganda spreads. A year ago, in March, an ISIS spokesman, Abu, and you can only imagine how I mispronounce his name, called on the group's followers to attack Christians and Jews anywhere they live, especially in the US, Europe, and Israel. He didn't limit his appeal to trained fighters. Instead, he encouraged any means available: stabbings, shootings, vehicle rammings. The call was framed as revenge for Gaza and Western wars in the Middle East, and it was broadcast as a broad incitement, not a narrow order. But here's the kicker. Talk about the government going after their own people. Well, they go after us in many ways. I just happen to be the recipient of this particular part, right, which is going on in my home now that's killing me. But the kicker is this: ISIS is the United States, right? ISIS is their god. So I've talked a lot about ISIS, but so this is not happening in a vacuum. I mean, authoritarian systems from East Germany's Stasi to Chile under Pinochet to Saddam's Iraq have always thrived by turning neighbors into informants and teaching society to police itself. So fear works as a weapon long before bombs or knives. And Stephen Miller, the guy in Trump's group, I don't really, I have plenty of things to do, but I did catch a clip of him literally screaming and foaming into the microphone, "If you see one of these people, call their employers," blah, blah, blah. So they're just, let me see how I phrase this. I think the Nazis were smarter. Whatever group of them were running the Nazi deal, and these people have all been a continuum, right? Whatever their ancestors were that were running the Nazi deal, they were just a lot brighter, okay? These people can't quite hide it as well, because the Nazis and them did a pretty good job of hiding things. Like, they totally hid their relationship with the Vatican for a long time. So anyhow, I started out focused on Pornhub, because I did that Pornhub show, recently. And I saw Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman is the guy who, he supposedly blew the whistle on Pornhub. And that's part of their pattern. What they do is, when things, what I call it, too hot in the kitchen, start to happen, they have to shut down the operation, right? Because by then probably too many attorneys are sniffing around. They probably can't contain the people. I mean, they could put the word out to the attorneys, don't be doing any lawsuits now. That happens all the time. When stuff gets too hot in the kitchen, that's just the best way to look at it. Then they bring in their friends at the FBI and stuff to secure all the evidence and stuff. Not complicated stuff here, right? So anyway, I was watching, looking around about Pornhub, and because Bill Ackman got called to my attention again, because he was the one, as part of this huge Charlie Kirk spin, running around saying that, well, I don't know, was it Israel? Anyway, so Bill Ackman got onto my radar again. So it was as simple as this. So I thought, well, I need to update my Pornhub thing, because Bill Ackman was involved in this Charlie Kirk thing, right? And so I thought, well, I got to update that file. And last I left off, I had figured out the logistics of Pornhub, because originally it came out of an Israeli company, this Pornhub. Anyway, so I knew I had more tracking to do on the group of people, because after the Pornhub thing got exploded, the people all shifted around. So I was trying to update as much as I could in that file. So, because last I left off, Pornhub was routing their money. They had offices in Amsterdam, but they were routing their money through Luxembourg. Never heard about that route, because I'm not obviously a financial reporter. So anyhow, so what I discovered was this, is that during the 10-year period, the whole group of them were rerouting their money. After I kind of left off with Luxembourg, I hadn't gotten the whole picture when I left off the last looking at my file. So come to find out, um, it's the exact same global pipeline. Like Netflix is in it, Pornhub is in it, all the gaming giants, all the gambling platforms, the Wall Street banks, and private equity. I call it a herd. I've been calling it a herd just to keep it straight in my own head, okay? So what I uncover is that as part of this Pornhub thing, it was more than that, right? Because obviously I just left off at the first step. so, so what it is that there's a group of them, we'll call them the herd, okay? And I couldn't even comprehend for a while because I had to keep thinking, no, wait a minute. Is this about like Netflix's European division spending money and sending money around? Or does this really mean all of Netflix's money, all of Pornhub's money is following this route, right? And that's when I sat up straight and I thought, wow, that is a ton, and I mean a ton of billions of dollars in tax evasion right there. So, yeah, because I had to sort through this whole pile of things because you got all these little terms and stuff. You got to figure out what is this, when did they meet, how did this get started, all this stuff, right? So, anyhow, so once I got past the spinning part, my eyes about popped open because I thought, wait a minute, every one of these people is now in a group routing their money in a specific way, okay? And I thought, Jesus God, that is a lot of money, right? And for some reason, in the middle of this, I only remembered reading about a reporter in Malta in 2017 being murdered, okay, in a car bombing. But really, that was all I knew. And there was a Malta journalist, Daphne Caruana Galizia. She was actually murdered in 2017 after uncovering many offshore money webs, okay? So, but I didn't know anything about this stuff, right? As a matter of fact, I did a show about the Panama Papers, and Daphne had indeed been part of the Panama Paper journalist group. So, but I didn't pick up on her name. I didn't pick up on any of the details of murder. All I knew was I'd seen this thing happen, corner of my eye type of thing, right? So, what this is about is this. It's big tech, the adult platforms, and the financial firms. What they have done is they have rebranded tax dodges as compliance, moving from Amsterdam, which they call the Dutch sandwich, tricks to today's hubs in Luxembourg, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. And it's really a story about violence, surveillance, and finance crossing borders. So, yeah, it's very interesting because I just stumbled on this way, and I put together some timelines. Of course, you know I love those timelines, right? And that's when I was going through the timeline process, I remembered the death of the reporter in Malta. No remembrance of her name or anything like that. And so for some reason I thought, well, why don't I take a look at that date and see how it fits in this timeline? And then I thought, holy crap. Anyway, so and the name Malta cropped up again, which got me looking and thinking about that region again, right? Because I've talked in the past about those Malta, you know, the people, the early crusaders and all that kind of stuff, right? So anyway, so, you know, because I've been running across all these mafia groups that I've talked about in the past, you know, like those Negrotti, the Italians, that all that tomato business they were running, and then the Malta region in general. So, and then I stumbled on another thing. I'm just giving you a quick overview now. I stumbled on another thing. Where did Malta come from? Well, Malta was intersex with the Habsburgs. So, it literally, so anyway, so then when I'm looking at Malta, it's these centuries, right? And then I'm thinking, hey, wait a minute. That's right around the centuries that would follow or before the Khazars, right? So here's how it went. It likely went, the Khazars were first, and the Khazars spread out there to Malta, and that's where the Habsburgs connected, because remember all this talking I've been doing about those Romanovs and the Habsburgs and stuff? And that is where they connect together, because the Habsburgs were the ones who actually gave Malta to Malta, right? So, because in the past I've talked about that Malta cross. Well, another fascinating connection. All of the logos, like there's this Malta cross, there's this Jerusalem design, and all of them originate out of the Vatican. So, so, so the Malta cross, and then they have this thing called the Jerusalem cross, and I have them all down below. I'll be going through them. But anyway, so they all connect to the Vatican. The Vatican actually is the person or firm or whatever that actually designed all those things. And so, and the interesting thing is, remember when I talked about the Ku Klux Klan? Well, the Ku Klux Klan, they came from that Malta logo. Their logo did, right? Because I pointed that out during the show. I said, look, it looks just like the Malta logo. Anyway, the Malta cross. I should call it the cross, not the logo. But anyway, so, and then I find that all of those logos as a group, no matter how similar you may or may not think they look together, but all of them source to the Vatican, okay? So the Catholic Church was the central authority. Every major knightly order, like the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, Holy Spectres, was founded under papal blessings and given its cross insignia. The crosses were functional logos. They weren't just decorations. They were uniforms, banners, and identity markers used to visually unite forces under a religious mission. So, and the continuity of those same logos or crosses come from the same institution, the church. So, the church preserved some of these orders for centuries, like the Order of Malta and the Holy Spectre, and their symbols stayed alive long after the Crusades ended. So, anyhow, so hold on to that thought. That's going to be today's show, is how this crazy money, this looking for this money, wound me back up in Malta. So I want to clear up something, because the other day I was very happy that Pakistan and that other country were recognizing Israel. And I think I may have left the wrong impression, because that was very much a knee-jerk reaction on my part, to be happy that they said something positive, right? Because I want to cheer on leaders now taking a stand, but I can't. This is theater at its finest moment. The goal is to look and say sincere things, so later they can say, yes, I sure tried and took a firm stand myself. What they want to do is show the coward's way out, okay? So many governments and world leaders only find their strongest voices after the destruction has already happened, when the costs are clear, the public mood has shifted, or when the conflict has produced shocking images that make silence politically untenable. By then, the damage is done. Lives are lost. Infrastructure is destroyed. Communities are displaced. Speaking up late can be a way of managing reputations, so they can later point back and say, see, we condemned it. Leaders often sound sincere because they must. Moral outrage is part of their job, not moral courage. But sincerity does not always equal risk-taking. A truly courageous stance is one taken early, before it's popular or safe, when speaking out might actually cost them alliances, votes, or political capital. Coming late, once the path is clear, is easier. It's a low-cost moral positioning. And we can look at this everywhere these people have traveled through. This is their behavior patterns. During the apartheid in South Africa, many Western leaders only condemned apartheid forcefully in the 1980s long after resistance was global and sanctions were unavoidable. The Holocaust and World War II refugees. Many governments spoke of compassion after the war, but had closed their doors when Jewish refugees sought entry in the 1930s. And I believe there were Jewish refugees which were not part of this whole Khazar club, who probably got stiffed and not let in, right? And of course we have the Iraq War. Some politicians condemned the invasion only years later when public opinion turned and the evidence of failures was overwhelming. In each of these cases, late condemnation often functioned as historical insurance to rewrite their role, soften their complicity, or avoid blame. Courage means standing against the tide, not with it once it turns. Leaders who wait until the rubble is already there are not risking much. They are managing their own appearances. That's why it can feel cynical. Their statements are not just about Palestine or any other crisis. It's about their own legacy. Timing reveals the difference between courage and cover. When the bombs first fell, most leaders stayed silent. When homes were turned to rubble and hospitals destroyed, they looked away. Only now, when the devastation is beyond denial, we hear their outrage. But also, where is our outrage against them? But outrage that arrives late is not courage, it's theater. It's a performance of morality once the cost of speaking has vanished. Leaders who wait until it's safe to take a stand aren't brave. They are rehearsing for history. Later, they'll point back to these statements and say, "See, I spoke out." That's not leadership. That is a con job. Courage means stepping in when the path is not yet clear, when speaking carries risk. Outrage that waits for permission isn't moral clarity. It's self-preservation dressed up as principle. Because right now we have this group of people, and this will lead into what I'm saying, this ISIS group in 2024 called up on supporters to attack Christians and Jews everywhere, with an emphasis on the US, Europe, and Israel. And that is in fact what they're trying to do right now. So today I'm going to be digging into more of the bigger picture about how this all works together. This big tech, the adult platforms, iGaming, and private equity move profits across borders in lockstep. What they did was they just rebranded avoidance as compliance under their G20 rules. It's incredible how simple it all was, right? So I'm going to start off this whole decade of what I'm calling the herd, okay? Started in 2013 and ended up in 2023. And it went from Amsterdam's golden era of the Dutch sandwich to today's substance first hubs in Luxembourg, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. But the interesting thing is, in the middle of the reset of them moving all these finances, a Maltese journalist, Daphne Caruana Galizia, was assassinated October the 16th, 2017. So this whole migration, I have timeline after timeline to show you how it all worked, okay? Went from 2013 to 2023. So when I looked at the date of when Daphne was assassinated, well, 2017 is right there clearly when they were just getting this whole thing thundering along the way, right? Because it was only 4 years after they got going. So I don't speak for anybody. I'm not saying that I don't know anything about her role in any of this stuff. I'm just putting together the dots here, okay? So it's how payment, what it is about, it's about how payment processors law firms and policymakers shaped a system where effective tax rates stayed compressed, while the public was told this problem they had was fixed. So anyway, here is what it consists of, okay? It's big tech and streaming, and their ad and subscription platforms with vast cross-border IPs, because this is all about, they have their protected properties, okay, right? So they have all these cross-border kind of deals, and so anyway, so let me keep reading. My tendency is to start to say, well, because I'll have how it happened in a bit here. So anyway, so basically, they have all these ads and subscription platforms like Netflix. They all do. The porn people, all of them have these platforms where they're collecting money, right? And because it spans over so many places. And what happened was the adult platforms had high compliance pressure, the card networks, to get into respectable EU bases. And the gambling and gaming people work as a group, and then there's the fintech and processor groups. So we really have big tech and streaming, adult platforms, and the iGaming and gambling group, and then there's the fintech and the processors, and then private equity. So we have 5 groups, okay? Interesting, it's always a 5, right? But anyway, so those 5 groups. So I was really, really puzzled over how private equity got into this mix, right? The fintech part, that is the payment gateway, and so that's what happens. That's how the money works, okay, for all those other groups. So anyway, so interesting thing I found out along the way. Malta's role as a hub for corporate shells, passport schemes, and gaming licenses placed it inside the European regulatory perimeter, yet close to offshore-style services. Daphne investigated corruption, money trails, and elite networks that intersected with these financial groups, right? Her assassination sits right within that group of all these people being targeted, right? So, who are these people? Well, funny you should ask. Last we left off, I was talking about the Khazars and how they became Eastern European, and now they're tech lords and all that. The Khazars took a very straight path to running everything today, right? So I've already had that show talked about that. So just as an overview, during the 7th, because we're going to be winding up with these nights of hospitality and all that stuff, so we need to set the stage here back again with these Khazars. During the 7th to 10th centuries, the Khazar Khaganate was at its strongest, between approximately 600 and the 960s. It ruled territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, controlling key Silk Road corridors. In the 8th century, the Khazars became famous for their conversion to Judaism. By the 900s to 970s, the Khazar Khaganate collapsed under pressure from the Kievan Russians and the Byzantine Empire. So by the 11th century, the Khazars had disappeared as a major power. So they went from the Khazars and they disappeared into Russia, right? Okay? So then, earlier than that, we have the Knights Hospitalier, and that is a group out of Malta. They were founded in Jerusalem in 1048 as a hospital order to serve Christian pilgrims. And in 1099, during the First Crusade, the order became militarized. In 1113, it was recognized as a sovereign order by Pope Paschal II. The order moved its headquarters to Rhodes in 1309. In 1530, it was granted the island of Malta by Charles V. at which point it became known as the Knights of Malta. And then the Maltese cross was adopted as the main emblem of the order during its period in Rhodes and Malta. Okay, so what did my beady little eyes see in all this? Well, Malta in 1530, right around that time, 1530, okay, not that long ago when all this stuff started happening, then in 1666, right? So, Malta in the island of Malta by Charles V. And I thought, Charles V. Well, Charles V was a Habsburg. Anyhow, so here's how it worked. The Khazars collapsed in the late 10th century around the 970s. The Knights Hospitaliers emerged in 1048 and onward. And that's a group in Malta, the Knights Hospitaliers. So what I'm saying is, I believe the Khazars became the Knights in Malta. They just moved their mafia structure, because at the end, these people are the Khazarian mafia, right? So they just moved their operation on. So that was roughly about a 70-80 year gap between the collapse of the Khazarians and the rise of the Hospitalier people, but it's not really a stretch, right? It still fits within some patterns here. Because the 7th to the 10th century, the Khazars controlled a key Eurasian choke point between the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and the Silk Road. Their territory became a vital land bridge for goods such as slaves, fur, silk, spices, and silver. Politically, they acted as middlemen between Byzantine, the Islamic caliphates, and emerging European powers. Puts them in an interesting spot, right? But their empire collapsed between 950 and 970 under the pressure from the people in Russia. They call them the Kievan Rus, right? And Byzantines. So, despite their fall, the Khazars left a significant legacy as a broker state that fused religion, commerce, and geopolitics. So yeah, I think the Khazars just picked up again, and they say that they got pressure from the Russians. Well, that was likely just how they moved them on the map, right? Well, we're going to go down there and we're going to act like we're going to take you over, so now we're going to move you over here closer to Russia. Right? Not complicated stuff, right? So that's our reeling it back a little bit further during the time of the rise of these Knights Hospitalier after the Khazars took over, right? I'm presuming, I'm saying they took over. You don't have to just agree with me, but I certainly have provided a lot of timelines for you to take a look yourself. But anyway, so the 11th to the 12th century, because remember the Khazars were, what was the 10th or something centuries. So right following that, and during the 11th to the 12th century, the rise of the Knights Hospitaliers. In 1048, a hospital was established in Jerusalem to aid Christian pilgrims. By 1099, during the First Crusade, this order transformed into a military force. In 1113, it received the papal order from the Catholic Church, and the Maltese cross became its emblem, symbolizing knightly virtue and territorial affiliation. So the Maltese cross, which is going to be on our minds a lot today, comes exactly from that time. So we left off there. So the 13th to the 16th centuries. By 1309, the Knights had moved their headquarters to Rhodes, over there in that part of the country, by the UK area, right? And in 1530, they were granted Malta by maybe Rhodes and Malta. I'm sorry, I'm a little fuzzy today. But anyway, so just hold that thought. I'll verify it later, but I don't want to trip myself up. I'm not feeling well. So anyway, so I'm not complaining, I'm just commenting, just be clear about that. Just like fumbling, I'm like, oh, what did I say? Okay, so Anyhow, Rhodes, whether it's in the UK or somewhere in Malta, could be in Malta. And then in 1530, they were granted Malta by Emperor Charles V. Over time, now we're still in Malta, they evolved into a naval power, engaging in privateering and building powerful fortresses. The order became deeply embedded in finance, religion, and regional politics. So then the 17th to the 18th century, as military technology and global dynamics shifted, the Knights lost their military relevance but retained symbolic prestige. The Maltese cross spread into our aristocratic heritage and was later adopted by Freemasons and other secret societies. See how this thread goes all the way through? So 18th to 19th century, Freemasons and the Brotherhoods. In 1717, the first Grand Lodge was established in London, formalizing Freemasonry. Freemasonry borrowed heavily from Crusader and knightly imagery. The Maltese cross became prominent in high Masonic degrees, particularly those involving the Knights Templar. This created a symbolic continuity from medieval knights to secret brotherhoods and elite societies, which really started to kind of rattle my brain a little bit at that point, right? So, because, I tried to look into this Maltese cross years ago and never got a really clear understanding of it, and that's why I always encourage look at the roots, right? So yeah, I kept getting more and more fascinated the more I looked. So the 20th century came in, the copycats and appropriations. During the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan in the United States underwent a revival. They invented, or they had this thing called mystic insignia of a Klansman, a red cross with flared arms and a central blood drop, mimicking Masonic and knightly styles. They also adopted faux knightly titles, robes, and rituals. They call themselves things like Grand Wizards and stuff like that. Meanwhile, the Maltese cross remained in legitimate use across Malta in firefighting emblems and military decorations, all of which further complicated public perception. Boy, I'll say, because, I knew the firemen had that logo, and I just was never able to connect all these little dots. But anyways, now we're looking at it, right? Because today, the Maltese cross continues to be honored in Malta, firefighting services, all over the place. The firemen use it, and military contacts. And here's what's really interesting. All of these early crosses and stuff, all of them now are hate symbols. They line up with every major hate group. Yeah, this thing doesn't seem so puzzling when you start to dig it apart, right? So, and they say, despite their different origins and meanings, confusion persists due to their similar bold, flared arm designs. And yeah, that had me confused, because the Malta one and the other ones, the Jerusalem, they have the Malta one or key, the Jerusalem one is where they honor their stuff about going back to Jesus and stuff. They have some visual things with the arms that are different, right? But there's something visually about them, because for years and years and years, I saw them as all looking the same. And when I looked at it even closer, the reason I was seeing that way, I think it was an eye trick, because they're all, no matter if they have the flared arms or what, they're all basically the same size, right? And they're the same red. So it does have like a rather tricky look on the eye. But now we settled it, right? And because the KKK used the blood drop cross, and that remains a hate symbol despite their different origins. Well, no, I believe they came from the same group, right? So then I started looking at these trade groups, right? Because I thought, well, I've been looking at trade groups, and we figured that we knew what the Khazars were doing between the 7th and the 10th century. And I had by then figured out that the Malta group came along from 11th to 16th century, right? So then I looked at their trade routes. So then I was wondering, well, if they did both these trade routes, would that like tie it all up? And I'll be darned, it sure does. So let me read this. I had to write all this down. So anyway, so the Khazars, 7th to 10th century. Geographically, the Khazars controlled the corridor between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, stretching into the Eurasian steppe. They taxed caravans and dominated segments of the Silk Road. The main goods passing through their territory included furs, slaves, silver, silk, and spices. After their trade route, the trade routes were taken over by the emerging powers such as the Kievan Russians and later the Mongols. So yeah, they kind of shifted it back to their old friends, the Kievan Russians, right? So then the Malta and the Knights from 11th to the 16th century. They were located in central Mediterranean. Malta acted as a maritime chokehold between Italy, North Africa, and the Levant. The Knights, the Maltese Knights, controlled naval routes and fortified the island. Their economy was linked to grain, spices, textiles, and pilgrims. And I don't know what the pilgrims means. But after the Knights period, Malta faced Ottoman pressure and was conquered by Napoleon in 1798 and came under British control from 1800 until independence in 1964. So that sounds to me like, I don't know, bring them back to the UK for a while, right? So what were the points between the Khazars and the Maltas? Well, the Khazars were a land-based chokehold. Malta was a sea-based one. Both accumulated wealth and power by controlling transit routes, collecting tolls, and offering or denying safe passage. They each used religious identity to legitimize their power. Judaism in the case of the Khazars, and Catholic crusading ideology in the case of the Knights of Malta. Controlling Khazar and Maltese routes would be like owning the medieval world's main highways, one over land, one over sea. Whoever held both had leverage over east-west trade and all the wealth. So yeah, that's where they're grabbing up all that money, right? And then I also have the information down below or on my website. I also listed what they claim happened pre all this stuff happened, right? I still believe it's just a roadmap. I would change my mind if those pyramids were real. Just kidding. But anyway, so so what happened was that it was this group called the Gor Turks, 6th to 8th century. We'll go back as far as, because the Huns and them were before this, but we'll start off at the Gor Turks, 6th to 8th century. The Gor Turks formed a vast Central Asian empire that included parts of the Caspian region. The western portion of their empire overlapped with what became Khazar territory. So the Khazars literally broke off from this Turkic confederation in the 7th century. So by the mid-600s, the Glukak Empire had fragmented, and the Khazars emerged as a dominant power in the lower Volga and Don regions, filling the void left by the decline of the Huns, Avars, and the Gokluks. They inherited control over steep tolls at the Black Sea Caspian choke point. So before the Khazars, other nomadic empires ruled the steppe trade routes. The Khazars were the next in line, carving out their power from the ruins of the Galtuk Empire and continuing the same old game: control the trade, control the profits. So the Khazars were brokers of overland trade during the Silk Road Golden Age. The Knights of Malta became the brokers of Mediterranean sea trade. So yeah, and these similar things all carried on. So, and then they work up to we went from Russia, where they were kept getting grabbed, right, the 15th to 17th centuries. Then Eastern Europe, 17th to 19th century. These ideas spread through the Jewish and merchant dysphoриas. And then, of course, 18th to 19th centuries, in Freemasonry, these knightly symbols were preserved and repurposed by elite secret societies. And then, of course, in the U.S., in the 20th century, the KKK emerges, right, with a different kind of an image. This is just a cut and paste thing, right? So, anyways, if the Khazars had survived underground, their legacy might look like this. From dominating Silk Road caravans to hiding inside Malta's religious orders, then embedding into Russia and European elites, resurfacing in Freemasonry, copied by the KKK, and finally taking shape in modern America as the invisible brokers of global elite. Makes sense to me, so I'll repeat it. So here's my theory. If the Khazars had survived underground, their legacy might look like this. They went from dominating Silk Road caravans to hiding inside Malta's religious orders, then embedding into Russia and European elites, resurfacing in Freemasonry, copied by KKK, and finally taking shape in modern America as the invisible brokers of global power. That's how I see this entire thing tied together. And this even relates to my very favorite film noir movie. This film noir movie was actually what would actually put film noir on the thing. I've talked about being a big fan, and when I was going through the history of these people back in the early days, what happened with these gypsies was that they literally invaded. Some of them went to Hollywood, some of them went into politics. I mean, and they always travel as groups, right? So I did some shows about my thoughts about this years ago, and walked you through the whole process because, yeah, I had been, and still am a fan of the film noir. Back then, they were actually quite brilliant. But Maltese Falcon in 1941 is what kicked it all off. And John Huston, Humphrey Bogart played the role of Sam Spade. And so Maltese, right? Here we are back at Malta, right? And I was laughing. I just looked at a summary, right? The film begins when a mysterious woman, Bridget O'Shanahay, played by Mary Astor, hires private detective Sam Spade to follow a man. Spade's partner is soon murdered, pulling him into a dangerous mystery. Everyone is after a priceless artifact, the Maltese Falcon, a jewel-encrusted statuette with legendary value. Spade encounters crooks like Joel Cairo, who is played by Peter Lorre, and Casper Gutman, who is played by Sidney Greenstreet, each desperate to claim the Falcon for their own. In the end, the object of desire is revealed to be a fake. Despite caring for Bridget, Spade hands her over to the police for killing his partner. So yeah, I don't know. It says that the film explores greed, betrayal, and obsession, highlighting the futility of chasing illusions. it is often considered the movie that launched the film noir genre. The Maltese Falcon itself is a classic MacGuffin, a symbol of desire that drives the plot but ultimately proves worthless. The movie is about crooks fighting over what turns out to be a fake treasure. Bogart's character survives by staying sharp and refusing to be fooled, even by someone he loves. Yeah, so anyway, so I put a link to the movie down below if you want to take a look at it. I'm planning on watching it myself this weekend, but okay, so there also is a connection with the Maltese hat and the Fez hat, and they get confused. The Knights of Malta were the Hospitaliers. They wore medieval European gear, helmets in battle, and black mantles with white Maltese crosses in ceremonial roles. So it was just the Ottomans from there who started off with the hats. So because it was 1800 onward, the fez became symbolic of Mediterranean identity. Some colonial troops recruited from Malta and North Africa even wore fezzes as part of their uniforms. And then the fez hat even went to the secret societies. I mean, there's just a lot of symbolism coming out of those regions, right? Why do you think they have so many earthquakes and wars and stuff and fires and stuff around places? Because they need to get back and tidy things up, right, and destroy what was there. And there's also all the stuff about all the secret societies, U.S.-based groups like the Shriners. They're a Masonic offshoot. They adopted red fez hats, and they're Masonics. They borrowed knightly and Maltese symbols, creating modern confusion between the Knights of Malta and the fez-wearing brotherhood. So yeah, they also merged the Knights of Malta with the fez hats. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about their personalities, according to historians, right? They claim that the Khazars were not shy about enforcing their dominance. Historical accounts describe them as fierce rulers who taxed caravans, raided neighbors, and crushed rivals. Kind of sounds like people run things now. Their business model was simple: pay us or suffer. Their aggressive behavior eventually led to the Russian Byzantines to destroy them. No, what happened was they played it out as long as they could, and then their pals in the Russia-Ukraine part came in and rescued them, right? That's the answer here. They just like they closed down these porn operations and stuff, they just had to close down that operation once the Khazars had, raided enough people, killed enough people, and all that kind of stuff. Then they brought in their friends from Russia-Ukraine area. The Knights of Malta had a similar reputation, but cloaked it in religion. Though they ran hospitals and bore crosses, they functioned as privateers and warriors. Operating from Rhodes and Malta, they raided Muslim shipping, they seized goods, and sold captives into slavery. Their naval campaigns were brutal, especially during events like the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. Even in centuries later, they were accused of acting more like pirates than saints. So yeah, that tells us a lot about those Knights of Malta, right? Yeah. So both the Khazars and the Knights of Malta blended commerce with violence. They both used religion, Judaism, and Catholicism, respectively, as a mask for power projection. They taxed, raided, and fought under the guise of legitimate authority. So the Khazars and the Knights of Malta seemed a little bit less than noble leaders to me, and more like mafia bosses with holy branding, right? They got rich by controlling trade routes and weren't afraid to fight dirty to keep them. Yeah, that mafia stuff really raises his dirty head, right? So yeah, I'm gonna need to take a break here.
This is the exact spot in the Maltese countryside where political journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated on the 16th of October last year. That afternoon, Daphne left her home in the village of Bidnia just before 3 p.m. As she drove down this hill, a remote-controlled bomb detonated under the driver's seat, hurling the vehicle off the road in a deadly explosion.
بالأول وحدة والآخر وحدة هم متورزيقة صارت بالله نار.
6 months on, police investigators have been painstakingly piecing together a detailed picture of how they believe Daphne's killers carried out their gruesome task. The first arrests in the case occurred roughly 7 miles from where Daphne was killed, here in the Maltese capital of Valletta. In the early morning of 4th December 2017, police and army units raided these warehouses in the port area of Malta. They arrested 3 men widely reported to be known to police: brothers George and Alfred Di Giorgio and their associate Vincent Muscat. It was here that police suspect Daphne's murder was planned. Investigators assumed the bomb had been triggered remotely by a mobile phone. So the question was, who was making calls that day, and from where? Thousands of calls had to be sifted before investigators found what they were looking for: the phone numbers of 2 devices that appear to have been used to detonate the bomb. The first device was a basic Nokia handset. This sent the bomb's activation code by text. A second device had a SIM card installed, which received the code and then detonated the bomb. Police called this the God device. On the day of Daphne's murder, this is how investigators believe events unfolded. At 1:41 a.m, the God device was switched on, sending a signal from Bidnia, where Daphne's car was parked outside her home. According to police, Alfred Di Giorgio spent the night in Bidnia. Police believe he was the lookout, and in the days before had been observing her movements from the ridgeline that overlooks the house. Meanwhile, according to police, phones suspected to belong to George were signalling from Valletta's Grand Harbour. Investigators matched the locations with CCTV footage and identified a distinctive small boat called the Maya. At 2:55 p.m, the Maya came to a stop and idled along a sheltered stretch of water beneath a war memorial known as the Siege Bell. Around the same time, Daphne was getting in her car to go to the bank. Minutes later, there were 2 phone calls to the boat, both from Bidnia. A text message is sent from the boat to the God device, detonating a bomb placed under the driver's seat of Daphne's car. At 3:20 p.m, phone data shows the Maya heading back towards the Grand Harbour. 10 minutes later, George sends a message from his personal phone to his partner.
"60 Minutes Rewind."
Malta, you miss.
Okay, I am back. Another day. We'll finish it up on this one, so let's keep rolling here. I was thinking about the fact that, well, just little facts that, like the United States lost the war. we never left being British. I mean, just little details like that, that the United States went bankrupt and that, in 1933 we were all declared enemies of the state. Those little details, because the United States never left the British, right? And I think this whole deal with Malta also never left the British. And let me just give you a brief recap here. Napoleon briefly seized Malta in 1798 during his campaign to Egypt. However, by 1800, the Maltese people, with British assistance, expelled the French. So Britain then assumed control of Malta, which was formally recognized as a British colony by the Treaty of Paris in 1814. And don't forget, the Habsburgs were the ones who tied up Malta in the first place, right? So over 160 years, Malta served as a vital naval base for the British Empire, often described as the unsinkable aircraft carrier due to its strategic location in the central Mediterranean. Malta remained a British stronghold until its independence in 1964. It later became a republic in 1974. And in 1979, the last British troops left the island at an event commemorating called Freedom Day. But did they really leave, or did they physically leave, right? I think the UK is the one that is running everything right through that City of London operation. So now that Malta is in this picture with all these things I'll be getting to in about 2 seconds here, where all this money is flowing for all this tax evasion, it just makes it something that we should all make a note. Did they really leave? I think they're just pulling the same strings today. Because, let me see here. Because if we just kind of look at this whole thing as sort of an arc, right? The last stage of this trip for the Khazars, I think they went under the wing of the UK, where this story all got started, with the Great Fire of London and the new fresh empire after 1666. Time to pack up in Malta and return home and consolidate it all is how I'm seeing it. They never really left, right? They didn't leave the United States. The ships sailed home to Mother England. So I think it's because of that location, and they just sent the ships home. And here is where this all ties together. Into Jerusalem in the 11th century. And here's a group we need to pay attention to. These Amalfi, A-M-A-L-F-I merchants. They're the ones who funded the Hospitaliers Hospital in Jerusalem in 1048. So they're the money behind the whole thing going into Jerusalem and the first hospital arrangement, right? So who are the Amalfi merchants? Well, they planted the seed for all this in 1048 with that hospital in Jerusalem. But that hospital grew into the Hospitaliers, who became crusading knights, naval powers and roads, and finally the Knights of Malta. A direct line from a small Italian trading republic to a global military order. So this is interesting, right? Because the Amalfi merchants were the first ones that I could find. So if you're looking at root theories, this is it. So these Amalfi merchants funded the Hospitalier Hospital in Jerusalem in 1048. So they literally planted this first seed, these Amalfi people, right? Well, they come out of Italy. What does this all mean? I don't know. They come from naval power on direct line. So they came for this Amalfi people come from a small Italian trading republic. So how that fits in, don't really know. So it actually started with these Amalfis in Jerusalem, okay? And then there was the first crusade in 1099, and the Crusaders took Jerusalem. And then the hospital becomes the Knights of St. John. So by 1113, papal recognition gives them sovereignty. So right after the First Crusade, the church, as in the Catholic Church, gives them sovereignty. So that means Jerusalem was a launching point, okay? And a religious hospital morphs into this order. So out of Jerusalem, let's follow that trail for a refresher here. 1187 to 1291. In 1187, Saladin retakes Jerusalem after the Battle of Hattin. Hospitaliers retreat to coastal Crusader strongholds. 1291, fall of Acre, the last Crusader outpost is gone. And then the Hospitaliers relocate, first in Cyprus, then in Rhodes in 1309. So, before that, then they became the Khazars, because the Khazars dominated that steppe from 650 to 960. They run the tolls at the Black Sea, Caspian chokehold. So yeah, it really started with these Amalfi people. That's where this all originates. And they're an Italian group. Interesting, right? And the Vatican, Italian, right? So how it fits, I really do not know. So anyway, so the other very interesting time was Malta, 1530 to 1798. In 1530, Charles V, remember the Habsburg, grants Malta to the Hospitaliers, and they were now called the Knights of Malta. They cloak privacy and privateering as a holy war. The Maltese cross becomes the global emblem. The naval base controls the Mediterranean chokehold. And then right on the heels of that, 18th and 19th century, in 1717, the first Grand Lodge of Freemasonry in London. That absorbs the Templar Hospitalier symbols, the crosses, the swords, and the rituals. And the Knights of Malta mythos becomes embedded into secret brotherhoods. And elites across Europe and the US use this framework for influence, this Masonic deal. And then there was the British Malta, 1800 to 1964. Napoleon seizes Malta. British expels French and takes Malta. Malta becomes the unsinkable area carrier of the British Empire. So yeah, it all kind of connects, right? I think how it happened was this. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, a new empire merges after all these other stuff with these Khazars and stuff, right? The city of London becomes the hub of finance and hidden networks. Malta, after centuries, is folded into British imperial control. The ships sail home. The consolidation of Khazars, Maltese, Freemasons, and they all thread under the wing of the UK. So that gives London its offshore satellites, Malta, Gibraltar, Jersey, and the Caymans, places where they're hiding all that money, right? So essentially, Jerusalem was the birthplace of the Hospitaliers. They had an expulsion and they lost the Holy Land, and they moved from there to Rhodes in Malta. The Khazars and earlier steppe brokers feeding into Eastern networks. Malta, they were naval brokers of sea trade. Freemasonry, they have nightly imagery preserved for elites. and the British Malta was the imperial chokehold. So England, final consolidation in City of London after 1666. So let's bring back the money here. I'll go through the list of characters that I'll be talking about with how they're transferring and stealing. I mean, this is robbery on the high seas, if I could grab a term from these people, right? The pirates are on the high seas. Well, who's the first pirate? Well, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, created in 1944 after World War II alongside the World Bank. It stabilizes the global financial system, lends money to countries in crisis, and sets rules for currency and debt, and boy did they ever. The other group on the ship, the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. That was founded in 1961. It's a club of mostly wealthy countries that sets guidelines on taxes, trade, and development, but doesn't provide loans. Then we have the G20, another part of the herd. I'm calling this whole group the herd, okay? G20, group of 20, formed in 1999. See those nines? 1999 is really 3 sixes flipped upside down, right? It's a forum where the world's 20 biggest economies coordinate global economic policy, including emerging economies like China, India, and Brazil. So what's the BEPS in this pack? Well, the BEPS is called the Base Erosion and Profit Sharing, and that was launched in 2013 at the request of the G20. This set of 15 international rules aims to stop multinational corporations from shifting profits to low-tax jurisdictions. So I always say this, evil has to come packaged as help, right? So basically, the G20 sat around and they cooked up this deal. Well, maybe we need to restructure the taxes because poor countries aren't getting as much money. So we need to restructure this. Well, that's where the trick lies, right? Because this was about restructuring it so they grab more. So what does this involve? Well, it involves something called IP holdings and royalty chains. That's why there's companies like all these gambling people and all these people, okay? Because the intellectual properties are like trademarks. Software code and patents are held in entities that collect royalties. Intercompany agreements set transfer prices, making operating subsidies show minimal profits. So what the deal was that after BEPS reforms, zero-employee shell companies became risky. So firms added small teams, local directors, and real office space to pass some inspections. And I'll be getting to why this all got triggered in the first place in a bit here. So there were treaty networks and routing. Payments are routed through countries with broad tax treaties to minimize withholding taxes. So there was a hybrid mismatch cleanup. Old tax tricks involving mismatches between jurisdictions have been replaced with cleaner, though still advantageous structures. And they have this thing called minimum tax layering, or Pillar 2. The global minimum tax aims to curb the most aggressive tax avoidance, but leaves room for complex planning via credits and timing differences. So the BEPS rules were primarily designed by wealthy OECD countries like the US, EU core, and Japan. Although emerging G20 members like India, Brazil, and South Africa participated, their calls for simpler and fair rules were mostly sidelined. As a result, BEPS provided political cover to rich countries while only offering limited new revenues to poorer nations. So here's how it kind of got started. Around 2012 to 2013, outrage grew over companies like Apple, Google, and Starbucks using complex tax structures, such as what they call the Dutch sandwich in Amsterdam, to minimize taxes. This made the Netherlands politically vulnerable and put pressure on global institutions to act. Amsterdam itself wanted the OECD-led reform process to move quickly. Their goal was to protect their reputation within the EU and manage the transition smoothly, maintaining stable financial flows rather than risking countries taking unilateral actions. So how did this get triggered? Well, by 2018, because up until this point, Amsterdam was where all the money flowed, okay? And that's where I first started off with the people at Pornhub, because I knew they were first running their money through Amsterdam. And then I found out that they actually had moved to Luxembourg, right? And that was where I left off before I tried to casually look this time and unwound all these symbols, all of this stuff and everything when I looked recently. So, because Amsterdam kind of wanted out of the picture, right? Here again, too hot in the kitchen, right? Because by 2018 to 2019, as Netflix's tax practices in Europe came under scrutiny in Italy and the UK, many companies began migrating away from Amsterdam. This marked the start of a new phase in global tax avoidance and reform. So why would they use a car bomb on Daphne? Well, car bombs are a classic tool of organized crime, especially in Mediterranean areas like Italy, Sicily, and Malta. They are designed not just to kill, but to send a public message of intimidation, revenge, and silence. Unlike discreet assassinations, car bombs shock the community and warn others not to investigate too deeply. Malta has long been considered a hotspot for smuggling, money laundering, gambling, and corruption, activities closely linked with organized crime. Well, the whole world is under a mafia structure, but Italian mafia groups such as the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and the Nagaretti, the tomato people, have operated through Malta, especially in fuel smuggling and gambling industries. Well, I guess they kind of had to take a break from those tomatoes, right? So Daphne was investigating corruption linking Maltese elites, offshore companies, and international money flows, networks that often overlap with organized crime. So the assassination of Daphne happened on October the 16th, 2017. Daphne was killed by a remote-controlled car bomb near her home. Investigations connected the murder to a network of businessmen, middlemen, and hired killers. It was a contract-style hit, not a random act. This fits the pattern of mafia-style enforcement: silence a journalist, protect the illicit networks, and intimidate others from digging further. So let's talk about how the herd met. They all met: the G20, the OECD, and the BEPS. The G20, a group of the world's largest economies, met in 2013, and they asked the OECD for Organization for Economic Cooperation, that's the OECD, and Development, a Paris-based policy club founded in 1961 to deal with rising outrage, I tell you, over corporate tax avoidance. That is the seat of the crime, right? In response, the OECD launched the BEPS project. It's called the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, but I'll just be using the code words from here on out. So that got started, this BEPS, in July of 2013, and they published a 15-point action plan. So in simple terms, BEPS was designed to stop companies from shifting profits into tax havens instead of paying where they actually do business. The goal was to close loopholes, but in practice, it became a managed reset. The old schemes like the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich were phased out. New rules came around in 2015 to 2021, and the biggest players learned to keep profits flowing under a more polished, compliant framework. So, yeah, they all work together now, don't they? So G20, the other groups, the IMF and the World Bank and them, they're actually permanent institutions, right? Because we have the IMF and World Bank created in the 1940s. The World Trade Organization was created in 1995. The G20 was later in 1999. So what they are, so the IMF and World Bank, they're formal institutions with buildings, staff, rules, and long-term programs. They make loans, run projects, and set conditions for countries. But the G20 is not a permanent institution, it's a forum. And it's the 20 biggest economies send their leaders and finance ministers to meet every year, and their central bankers more often. They don't run programs or give loans. Instead, they issue communiques or agreements that set the political direction. So the G20 sits above politically. It's where the most powerful countries agree on priorities. The IMF, World Bank, and OECD often carry out the technical work that the G20 asks for. For example, in 2013, the G20 asked the OECD to design the BEPS plan. So, yeah, it took me a while to kind of get all these things going in my brain, right? Because at first it was just like a blur of text. But here's the thing, this is on purpose. Just learn how to get to the root of things, and it unlocks them all. So who are the G20 members? They're the old guard, the advanced economies, the US, Canada, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, European Union as a bloc, Australia, South Korea, and then we have the newer giants, the emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Argentina, and Russia. Now, clearly, I'm well aware that people in Russia are white, but if you look at the top group of people outside of Japanese, well, Japanese people still are white too, right? So the top people, in my impression, it looks like a pretty white crowd of people in this herd, right? So together, these 19 countries plus the EU make up the G20. And the G20 makes up about 85% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. So, what roles does a herd play in this BEPS business? Well, rich OECD members and heavy users of the BPS tools. Well, that number one is the United States. It served as a home base for most multi-international corporations such as Google, Apple, Netflix, and Facebook. While publicly supporting reform, the U.S. aimed to ensure the new rules remain favorable to its corporate giants. Well, of course, doesn't take a crystal ball to figure some of this stuff out. So, the UK was facing domestic pressure after high-profile hearings involving Starbucks and Google sought to appear tough, and so they sought to appear tough on tax avoidance. Germany, France, and Italy, as core EU economies, pushed strongly for fair taxation rules, particularly targeting U.S. tech companies. Other OECD-aligned countries like Japan, Canada, and Australia supported the reforms out of concern for tax base erosion and lost national revenues. The European Union, acting as a bloc, pushed pressure onto tax haven members like Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. However, the EU also tolerated loopholes within its own system for years. So the Netherlands, Ireland, and Luxembourg, though not G20 members, were central players. They operated as tax routing hubs and eventually had to yield to reform pressure from both the EU and the OECD. India was one of the most vocal advocates, pressing for digital taxation rules and introducing its own equalization levy when global progress stalled. China supported global tax reform, but was cautious to protect its appeal to foreign investors. Brazil demanded stronger rights for source countries, those where products are sold and services delivered. South Africa emphasized the particular challenges and tax losses faced by developing nations. Countries like Indonesia, Mexico, Argentina, and Turkey supported the reform effort, but lacked the leverage to shape it meaningfully. So for resource-rich players, the focus was on stability. Saudi Arabia and Russia, while less concerned with tech sector avoidance, focused on securing stable revenue from energy and foreign investments. Their priority was financial and political stability over aggressive tax reform. So what does this really mean? Well, the BEPS rules were shaped primarily by the rich, and I say white, OECD countries, including the US, EU core, and Japan. Although emerging markets like India, Brazil, and South Africa participated in negotiations, their proposals for simpler and fairer systems were largely sidelined. Ultimately, the BEPS reforms offered political cover to wealthy nations, while giving only modest revenue gains to poorer countries. So let's talk Dutch sandwich. They come up with such a weird name, right? The Dutch sandwich was a tax avoidance technique heavily used by U.S. multinationals. It involved routing profits through the Netherlands to bypass EU withholding taxes before moving them to non-EU tax havens such as Bermuda. Often paired with the double Irish, the single Malta, or the CAIA structures, this method allowed profits originating in Europe or elsewhere to be funneled through Irish or Luxembourgish entities to minimize tax. By 2010, Ireland had adjusted its tax laws, making it possible to bypass the Dutch sandwich altogether while still achieving the same tax avoidance. So what was the triggering incident? Between 2012 and 2013, the scene of the crime, right? A series of high-profile tax scandals erupted in the UK. Parliament interrogated Starbucks, Google, and Amazon for paying minimal taxes despite massive sales. In the U.S., a Senate investigation exposed Apple's use of Irish subsidies with no declared tax residency. These events brought global attention to tax avoidance strategies such as the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich. The resulting media storm and political outrage, especially in Europe, forced the G20 in 2013 to ask the OECD to initiate the BEPS project to reform international tax rules. Yeah, something was clearly too hot in that kitchen, right? So they all had moved billions across borders to dodge taxes and conceal profits. Their strategies were coordinated using the same advisors, exploiting the same legal loopholes, and sheltering in the same tax havens. That's why I'm calling them the herd, right? Or the pack. At the center of the financial web was the 2016-2017 assassination of Daphne, a Maltese investigative journalist who was uncovering corruption in Malta's offshore financial world. Does it connect? Well, I don't know. Everybody's going to have to thinky for themselves. I see a very, very direct connection to her death. And also, ever since her death, the Daphne's silence. Nothing really got reported after her death about any of these moves. Funny, huh? Funny how that happened. So, it took me a while to figure out. I mean, I kept thinking, well, maybe this is one division of Google. Maybe it's one part of Amazon. No, it is all of their money, all of it. So between 2013 and 2023, the herd, the multinationals, they moved across sectors like big tech, adult content, iGaming, gambling, and Wall Street orchestrated a decade-long migration of profit flows. It began in Amsterdam during the golden years of the Dutch sandwich and double Irish structures. But as OECD-led BEPS reforms kicked off in 2013, the herd began to move. By the early 2020s, these same profits were being rerouted through substance-first jurisdictions like Luxembourg, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus, regions offering legitimacy on paper while continuing to support profit shifting in practice. So it was at the 2013 G20 summit, world leaders turned to the OECD to stop corporate tax dodging. That moment marked the beginning of a massive reorganization in global tax flows. So this just isn't a story of tax avoidance, it's one of coordinated movement, hidden power, and lethal secrecy. How'd the herd move? Well, I tracked the whole herd. First came the high-tech giants, Google, Apple, Facebook, who built the infrastructure of tax avoidance using Irish and Dutch schemes. Next followed the streaming services and adult entertainment companies, channeling profits through Luxembourg, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Then came FinTech, it's F-I-N tech, that's just the money, and private equity, which funded online betting platforms, sports stream services, and adult content empires, all engineered to keep profits away from tax authorities. So why is, I don't want to hold the secret here, why is private equity in this? That had me stumped for a while, but here's why private equity is, because it didn't make sense that you'd have the high-tech people and all of those people and the gaming people. I could see those, right? But I kept thinking, why is private equity in here? Well, all that money that they're stealing from people, all that false things. I hope to get back to private equity because Larry Fink and them, of course, they're all Eastern European Jews, right? So, but anyway, private equity is the one that's funding all this stuff. Private equity is fueling all these dirty trades like this. Well, I think they're dirty trades. They're the ones funding the adult content. Private equity is funding all the gaming and the gambling, all that. So that's why private equity is into the picture here. So this exploration maps how big tech, big porn, and big money restructure their global operations in response to BEPS. It started with a G20 meeting aimed at creating a fair tax system, but ended up with a system still rigged for the powerful. So let's go over this setup. At a G20 meeting, world leaders sat down and launched what would become a decade-long tax reform project. Officially, this was presented as a bold plan to fix global tax inequity and help poor countries claw back revenue from corporate tax dodging. That was the pitch. But what really happened behind closed doors was different. The plan was designed to restructure global tax rules in ways that largely protected the interests of wealthy nations, particularly the G7 countries, the white crowd in Japan, and major multinationals. Developing countries were invited to the table, but they were handed crumbs, while the big players secured a more stable and controllable system for global finance. So that is how the whole trick got carded, right? So according to research and policy groups like the IDOS, developing countries face significant disadvantages in the BEPS era. They often lack the technical capability, data access, and administrative resources needed to implement the complex international rules provided by the OECD. So you imagine that. These countries are also under heavy pressure to attract foreign investment and often offer tax incentives that in turn erode their own tax base. The result is a vicious cycle. Developing economies give away more to get less, and the promised tax fairness rarely materializes in full. From the OECD and UN documents themselves, the BEPS action plan was meant to bring fundamental changes to global tax systems. It aimed to combat harmful tax practices, align taxation with real economic activity, and restore trust in international tax fairness. Developing countries were described as key victims of BEPS because they rely heavily on corporate income tax and are disproportionately affected by base erosion. These countries were among those supposedly set to benefit the most from BEPS reforms. The documents also emphasized market jurisdictions, countries where goods and services were consumed, as deserving of a greater share of tax revenue. The repeated mantra was this: profits should be taxed where value is created. And I looked into how they marketed this. The marketing strategy behind BEPS was savvy. First, the project was framed around fairness. Governments and global institutions declared their intent to level the playing field, help developed nations, and restore public trust in taxation. Then came the emotional appeal. Official reports and presentations included charts showing underfunded hospitals and schools, pointing to the damage caused by profit shifting. The implication was clear: fixing BEPS would fix this injustice. Lastly, they created an inclusion framework, inviting developing countries and NGOs to participate. But real power over rulemaking remained in the hands of OECD members, G20 governments, and the big four tax firms and corporate lobbyists. While the reforms offered some new revenue to poor countries, but the most meaningful benefits were engineered for the wealthy, might I say white nations, and major corporations. Under the guise of transparency and fairness, the Pillar 2 minimum tax rules introduced in BEPS were highly technical and administratively burdensome. giving a clear advantage to rich countries with sophisticated tax enforcement systems. Meanwhile, multinational companies were granted more certainty and predictability in their tax bills. Their effective tax rate stayed low, in the single digits or low teens. But now they're dressed in a new suite of legitimacy. Loopholes weren't eliminated, they were codified, sanitized, and blessed under OECD approval frameworks. Who are the real winners? Well, countries like Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands remain attractive destinations for profits, but now with a stamp of approval from the EU and OECD as long as they can meet minimum substance requirements. The public believed the loopholes had been closed. Politicians claimed victory. Big Tech and Wall Street claimed compliance. In truth, the game had simply been reset with new rules, rules written for and by the players already in control. I think this was brilliantly marketed. The architects of BEPS didn't just respond to public pressure, they flipped it on its back. They took the outrage over tax injustice and channeled it into a campaign that diffused political risk, locked in low tax arrangements, and made multinationals look responsible. Governments claimed to have made big tech pay its fair share. Corporations claimed they were now in full compliance, and developing countries got a modest revenue boost, but not the systematic change they were promised. All while the financial flows quietly migrated from Amsterdam to Luxembourg, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus in full view, but with very little scrutiny. Groups like Tax Justice Networks, Oxfam, and Christian Aid have pointed this out for years. They make claims like BEPS has been hijacked by rich countries to protect their own tax bases while offering only crumbs to developed nations. They said the reforms make tax avoidance more sophisticated, not impossible. It's a political theater of compassion covering a global re-legitimization of profit sharing, but it's now sanitized and rule compliant. The OECD and the G20 framed BEPS as a moral victory. Journalists covering economics tend to trust OECD and G20 communiques, so they reported the headlines like "Global leaders agree to end tax avoidance." Once a good guy narrative was locked in, most of the press moved on. The story was seen as solved. BEPS documents are hundreds of pages long, filled with technical tax language, action plans, transfer pricing, updates, hybrid mismatch rules. It's dry, complicated material, and very few reporters have the background to challenge the spin. As a result, the public just hears a simplified message: problem solved. The BEPS project had over 135 countries in agreement with backing from the IMF, World Bank, and the EU. It appeared to be a true global consensus, and when everyone agrees, there's little room for dissent in mainstream media coverage. There were a few critics, like the Tax Justice Network. They were often sidelined as mere activists rather than treated as serious watchdogs. That framing further weakened any remaining counter-narratives. Big media organizations rely heavily on corporate advertisers, many of which are the same multinational companies that benefited from BEPS 2.0. At the same time, governments wanted to declare victory, not reopen a politically complicated fight. With no strong champion, To keep the story alive in the mainstream conversation, it faded from public view. The public perception was simple. They fixed it. But the reality? They quietly migrated profit shifting into new structures under a polished, global approved framework. It was a systematic compression of the effective tax rate year after year across huge global revenue streams. This trick the herd pulled reliably topped 10 to 15% points off a company's tax rate. It started with Netflix getting into trouble with Europe. If anybody wants to try to figure this out, I would start with Netflix because of Netflix, a lot of public records became unleashed. I, unfortunately, am not in a position to run the numbers and do all that. But if I were wanting to run the numbers and figure this out, I would definitely start with Netflix because you'll find a lot more documents to get you started. So, because there's more public records and so for Netflix, that means hundreds of millions to over $1 billion. I got as close as about $1 billion per year that Netflix may be saving. But like I said, don't trust my math, go do your own math. So between 2013 and 2020, billions were saved globally by routing profits through the Netherlands and similar hubs. From 2021 onward, there was a partial retreat, but companies continued optimizing, now under the BEPS compliant rules. And in 2024 to 2025, as global enforcement tightens, the herd is pushed into final compliance, but effective tax rates still remain well below statutory rates. And this was interesting. I looked into the marketing they did to poor countries. The OECD and the G20 didn't just talk vaguely about helping developing countries. They produced projections showing how much extra tax revenue poor countries might collect. But when you look closely, the numbers are small compared to the global pot of money. So, the OECD's impact assessments projected that BEPS measures like country-to-country reporting, so they claim they'll recoup for, I don't know, too much for me right now. The bottom line is this: the OECD and the G20 admitted that developing countries lose the most, especially when measured as a percentage of GDP. However, the projections showed that only a few extra $1 billion per year would flow back into those countries under the reforms. So they were sharply criticized by several people, okay? And what happened with that sharp criticism? Well, the sharp criticism came from a couple groups. The Tax Justice Network labeled the BEPS outcome as smokescreen, arguing that it institutionalized profit shifting under new rules instead of eliminating it. Oxfam criticized the reforms for leaving poorer countries behind, pointing out that most lacked the capacity to administer the high complex rules introduced by the OECD. These watchdogs weren't being cynical, they were pointing to the exact numbers and internal projections that modeled how little would flow to the countries most harmed by corporate tax avoidance. So, the watchdogs did their job. Groups like Oxfam, the Tax Justice Network, Christian Aid, and even some researchers from the IMF loudly criticized the OECD BEPS process and its outcomes. Their critiques were Their critiques were detailed, urgent, and aimed squarely at exposing the imbalance of how the new tax rules were designed. But despite their efforts, these warnings rarely made it into sustained mainstream headlines. Oxfam, for example, called the OECD agreement a historically missed opportunity. They warned that the deal would mostly benefit the richest countries and that developed nations, the ones most hurt by profit shifting, would still be left behind. The problem, according to Oxfam, was that the rules were far too complex and clearly tilted in favor of G7 economies. The Tax Justice Network was similarly vocal. It criticized the BEPS reforms for leaving tax loopholes wide open and for giving political cover to multinationals. They released detailed reports showing that while the branding had changed, profit shifting would continue, just under more structured, BEPS compliant frameworks. Even IMF economists quietly admitted the same. Despite the watchdog's work, their concerns never reached wide public awareness. There are several reasons why mainstream media didn't run with the story. First, there was the complexity and boredom factor. OECD action plans are dense, technical documents filled with legal and financial jargons. Most journalists covering general news don't have the tax expertise to decipher them, and many editors simply don't see this kind of story as headline material. It's not sexy, it's not visual, and it doesn't scream scandal even when it is one. Second, there was the problem-solved narrative. The OECD and G20 declared that they had successfully tackled profit sharing. The media, looking for a clean story arc, reported that narrative as a global win. Much like with the 2008 financial crisis, where reforms were praised before deeper problems reemerged, once the headline said tax avoidance fixed, the public moved on. Finally, there's a matter of advertising and political pressure. Many major groups rely on each other, so they really didn't have a lot of incentive, right? So it all started, and I have it all down below, the whole timeline, because it started in 2012 when Starbucks faced hearings in the UK. Then 2013, then we had the public awareness breakthrough in 2016 when the Panama Papers were leaked. And keep in mind, Daphne was also involved in the group doing the Panama Papers. So around 2016, the Panama Papers were leaked, revealing 11.5 million documents from the law firm Mossack Fonseca. These exposed the use of offshore companies and secret ownerships worldwide. The leak pushed the issue of tax avoidance and shell companies into the public political mainstream. Countries began aligning domestic tax laws and BEPS recommendations. Yeah, they figured, wow, we better get on this, right? The EU began implementing its anti-tax avoidance directive in 2017. Yeah, the pressure was really cooking up, right? So I find it very odd that right in the middle of that, Daphne gets executed, right? Because right in the middle of all of this stuff, and the most curious thing was this Netflix thing. The Italian prosecutors launched a tax evasion probe against Netflix, claiming it had a taxable presence in Italy. Yeah, this whole thing really goes round and round and round, right? And that was what happened after I left Pornhub in Luxembourg, right? So actually, the Netflix's Dutch operations evolved into a coordination hub. Yeah, and it's really, when you take a look at, if you learn to love timelines as much as I do, and learn to look at root causes, the stuff really starts to fall into place. This herd started really running once I got the first whistle that things were starting to not look too well, like people were starting to investigate. here again, this is another example of it was clearly too hot in that kitchen, right? So, yeah, I've got it all down below. I'm scrolling through real quick to make sure I got it all for today because I'd like to kind of close off this thing because, yeah, um, it just basically, once things get too hot in the kitchen, and it certainly looks around that 2013 time frame, they became concerned about things, right? So then they finally had to get up and do something about it. And basically how it works is this, it's the same group of them. That's why I'm calling them a herd. They use the same group of tax attorneys. So what happens is that they all move as a big group. So because like the content industry and the porn people and stuff, they move, let me see, the owners of Pornhub maintained its presence in Luxembourg, but some of them moved their headquarters to Cyprus. But some of them are still using their headquarters in the Netherlands, but they're not running the money through there anymore, right? So, yeah, that's exactly how it shifted. Kitchen was too darn hot, and they just had to get the heck out of there, right? And the public was starting to squawk. That's why I'm an advocate of squawking, right? Keep talking as long as you can. Why shut up early, right? Why shut up early? Uh, they're terrified of our voices. I mean, these are the same people that had to remove the downvotes from public things because they can't take any kind of negative criticism. They fold like crazy because behind it all, these are psychopaths. And really, in summary, the Great Fire of London marked the rebirth of the City of London and its financial empire. The same city that absorbed these symbols of knightly orders and Masonic lodges. Now, centuries later, fire brigades across the USA and other parts of the world carry the Maltese cross on trucks, helmets, and patchworks. So it's very curious to me that a symbol born in war and fire in Malta ended up on every U.S. firehouse. So yeah, it's weird. And it's weird how all of these original symbols and stuff ended up being hate crimes now, right? So yeah, we have the Knights of Columbus. They're still operating with all of those emblems from the Maltese emblems. The Masonic and fraternal orders, they're still using these Crusader and Middle East revival symbols. We have the military and the veterans units, the U.S. Navy and Coastal Guard. Sometimes they incorporate cross pates like the Maltese variations. We have certain Army divisions and state National Guards have used the Maltese cross in logos inspired by their meanings. So, and the Order of Malta is still active today under Catholic authority. It operates globally in hospitals, and be careful in those hospitals. That's where the word hospital came from, was hospitaliers. So yeah, they're still cruising around hospitals, and they use that symbol, the Maltese cross, appears on medical banners, ambulances, and uniforms. That's what I'm saying. Hospitals are pretty risky business. The St. John's Ambulance Service, from the same knightly heritage, uses the Maltese cross in its branding worldwide, and it has chapters in the U.S. So some U.S. police departments also use the Maltese cross, along with the firemen's. So, yeah. So these people, these crusaders, these people, they have never, ever left. Besides firemen, you'll see the Maltese cross carried forward by Catholic fraternals, the Knights of Columbus, the Masons, some military units, humanitarian groups like the St. John's Ambulance. So yeah, that logo is still all over, and where else is it? Well, remember the Ku Klux Klan used all those knightly things, right? Freemasonry used all those knightly things. We have other groups like this Oddfellows group. They adopted knightly or medieval roles like the Grand Noble Grand or the Grand Patriarch. Same words, right? We have the military orders, the Order of the Garter, still going on in the UK right now. The Order of St. John, the Order of Malta. And they use titles like Grand Master, Commander Knight, and they're still active today. And if you want to look further, the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts borrowed some of their code of honor language, and I have yet to get back to the Boy Scout, another horrible boy raping group. Groups like the Knights of Pythias from 1860 onwards frame themselves as guardians of loyalty, friendship, and charity, and they also use the Templar deals. And now there's motorcycle clubs. Run. The Knights Templars are a motorcycle club. We have the Crusaders are also a motorcycle club. So, the U.S. has a long tradition of groups dressed up in knightly language, from the KKK, and they use the Grand Wizard, to Catholic fraternal titles like the Supreme Knights, to Masonic Templars. All of them hijack medieval titles to project this. So the KKK was reinvented as a sacred order using knightly cosplay. This stuff, if you look around, is not that complicado, right? So, and these things are all intentional. I remember I worked in Silicon Valley and I worked in the marketing area, right? We didn't have computers in the very early days. So if you needed to present something to a company, like let's say their next design for their next brochure or something, I literally would have to hire a graphic artist to do my mock-up. And in that mock-up, you had to specifically use exactly their right logo. You had to use exactly whatever Pantone color they had directed. You better have that registered mark in the right place. I literally saw roomfuls of executives lose their minds when somebody presented just a simple artboard of what it was going to look like in the future using a shade off of the wrong color. They literally almost blasted their own heads off, so furious that the logo was wrong, they really could not focus on the rest of the presentation. That is why I started hiring graphic artists, because I didn't want to get my head blown off, right? So yeah, logos are not just random. They absolutely mean the world to these people. So you strip away the robes, the fezzes, and all of that, and really we got the same people beneath it all. And who do we have in charge right now? There's this person called Pete Hegsworth. I'm trying to find it. I must have scrolled past it. Let me see here. I got to tell you this one. This is a good one. Well, I'll have to go from memory. There's a head person in the military, Pete Hegsworth. He was a Fox News contributor who's now running a big department of the military. Well, on his front chest, he has this huge, I mean, it is huge cross, okay? At first, I thought that was the Maltese cross on his chest. But no, it is actually the Jerusalem cross. The Jerusalem cross looks like the Maltese cross, but it has 4 little crosses surrounding it. He has that emblazoned on his front chest, okay? I'll have a picture of it over on my website. We have now come full circle. We're full now part of all this knightly order stuff, right? It is right here in all of our faces. If you start to look around, it becomes pretty hard to look the other way, because that is exactly what the plan is, right? These same people designed those specific, absolutely specific logos. And the Jerusalem cross and the Malta cross, both of them came out of the Vatican. They weren't just randomly designed. This wasn't randomly cooked up. And these people seem to be wanting to send us some kind of a message by hiring a dude with a huge medieval symbol right on the front of his chest. Kind of a crazy message, but really, they're the ones that invented this symbolism. I think they invented it all from start to finish. So, but that's just my view. Maybe you believe this has gone on for thousands of years. I think they picked up and took over a few hundred years ago. And maybe this all stuff is all invented. But it doesn't matter if they invented it or not. The facts are the facts, right? This same group has taken all of these early medieval symbols, and now all of those same symbols actually play into the white the white groups, right? now they're part of the motorcycle gangs and they're part of the different, more militant white Christian groups, right? Well, they want to return the United States as some sort of white Christian thing. What they want and what they're going to get are two different issues. It depends on, is everybody just going to remain silent or not? But for that question, I have no answers. I'm trying to do what I can to keep talking. So be safe out there, and goodbye for now.